Question 24 of Prima Secunda continues our treatise on the passions, and it is the third question, going all the way to question 48 on the passions. And if you're following along in the Summa and you want to know the overall structure, as we've talked about a few times, but I think it bears repeating, is that the Summa is about our journey from God back to God and all the different faculties of the human person and the ways in which God draws us back to himself, which is our ultimate goal, is to unite with him forever in heaven, united with him in beatitude. And Thomas defines beatitude as basically a knowledge of God. And of course, once you know God, you will love God because you'll be united to him, and you can never go away from knowing the perfect good, loving the perfect good. And so while we are traveling through this world, we have challenges because of original sin. It makes it very challenging for us to get back to God. And one of the things that is interesting about the human person that, like the angels, for example, don't have to deal with are the passions. But we do share them with the brute animals like dogs and cats and grasshoppers, I guess, to some degree as well. There are certain passions, things that happen to us, sometimes and oftentimes out of our control. We get angry and sad, and we might have hope and despair and love, and they just kind of happen to us. And so this is what this whole treatise is about, is these interesting passions that happen to us and things that we feel, emotions, and how do we deal with them? How do we define them? How do we differentiate them? And in the 4 articles of this question, we're talking about the good and evil in the passions of the soul. And as I said, these are things that happen to us, and are they good or bad? Are they something that is subject to discipline or punitive measures? That they could be, as Thomas is going to describe. So how do we tell if a passion is good or if it's bad? And that's what is on Thomas's mind as he goes through these 4 articles here. The first one says whether moral good and evil can be found in the passions of the soul. Like this lady here clearly is experiencing some kind of passion. I don't know exactly what it is, but can she say, oh, this is a bad passion, this is a good passion? And Thomas says we may consider the passions of the soul in 2 ways. First, in themselves. Secondly, as being subject to the command of the reason and will. This is going to be the common theme that we see through these 4 articles, is that passions are subject and are controlled by the reason and the will, and to the degree that they conform to right reason, they're going to be okay, and to the degree that they don't conform to right reason or they depart from reason, they're going to be bad or detrimental to our overall well-being. If then the passions be considered in themselves, to wit, as movements of the irrational appetite, thus there is no moral or good evil in them, since it depends on reason. If, however, they be considered as subject to the command of the reason and will, then moral good and evil are in them, because the sensitive appetite is nearer than the outward members to the reason and will, yet the movements and actions of the outward members are morally good and evil, inasmuch as they are voluntary. Okay, so I think by the outward members he means actions that we do. I think that goes back to the actions. That's would be outward movements, outward things that we do. But what about the passions? And he says, much more, therefore, may the passions, insofar as they are voluntary, be called morally good or evil. And they are said to be voluntary either from being commanded by the will or from not being checked by the will. So when we feel a certain passion, the reason will have to moderate it. Or if you feel angry and you want to act out in that anger, your reason may say, well, tap the brakes there, and then you can will a response based on that particular passion that you're feeling. Article 2 says whether every passion of the soul is evil morally. Is every passion morally? And it's interesting what he does here, because he goes back to some of the previous philosophers and how this question was handled differently by different schools of philosophy, I guess you could say. He says, on this question, the opinion of the Stoics differed from that of the Peripatetics. Now, the Peripatetics were the followers of Aristotle. Peripatetics has to do with walking, because Aristotle was known to teach as he walked, and so his students were called peripatetics because they were walking as they were learning. For the Stoics held that all passions are evil, while the peripatetics maintained that moderate passions are good. The Stoics, by the way, in case you're not familiar with them, were in the time after the time of, say, Socrates and Aristotle and Plato and Aristotle, still largely BC, but they mostly before Christ. But Stoicism is alive and well and actually quite a popular philosophy in our day and age right now. So it never left, but the classic age of Stoicism was mostly in the time of, like Marcus Aurelius was the Roman emperor, and he was a Stoic, and there was a slave named Epicletus, who also was a Stoic. So it really had nothing to do with your level of society. Anybody can be a Stoic, whether you're the emperor or whether you're a slave, or the Stoicism is not dependent upon where you are in the social structure, as those two men showed. Okay, this difference, although it appears great in words, is nevertheless in reality none at all or but little, if we consider the intent of either school. For the Stoics did not discern between sense and intellect, and consequently neither between the intellectual and the sensitive appetite. All right, so to St. Thomas Aquinas and Aristotle, there's a big difference between the sensitive appetite and the intellectual appetite, right? The sense has to do with our body, our passions, our desires, and our intellectual appetite is not connected to any kind of passion. It's an intellectual appetite. It's free of the influence of passions. It's the will, right, to desire something. Hence, they did not discriminate the passions of the soul from the movements of the will, talking about the Stoics here, insofar as the passions of the soul are in the sensitive appetite, while the simple movements of the will are in the intellectual appetite. All right, so they didn't make that differentiation. It was all the same to the Stoics. But every rational movement of the appetitive part they called will, while they called passion of movement that exceeds the limits of reason. Now, you can see the difference here because St. Thomas Aquinas in the previous article said that passions are okay as long as they're controlled by reason and will, but when you don't differentiate between the sensitive appetites and the intellectual appetites, there's no command or difference between the passion and the faculty that is really responsible for keeping these passions in check, which would be the reason and the will. Wherefore Cicero, following the opinion, calls all passions diseases of the soul, whence he argues that those who are diseased are unsound, and those who are unsound are wanting in sense. Hence we speak of those who are wanting in a sense to be unsound. On the other hand, the peripatetics, Aristotle's followers, gave the name of passions to all the movements of the sensitive appetite, wherefore they esteem them good when they are controlled by reason. So you see where St. Thomas Aquinas gets this, and evil when they are not controlled by reason. Hence it is evident that Cicero was wrong in disapproving of the peripatetic theory of a mean in the passions when he says that every evil, though moderate, should be shunned, for just as a body, though it be moderately ailing, is not sound, so this mean in the diseases or passions of the soul is not sound. For passions are not called diseases or disturbances of the soul, save when they are not controlled by reason. So interesting, the Stoics came after the peripatetics. So they would have had this teaching of Aristotle and the peripatetics available to them, but apparently they rejected it. Article 3, whether passion increases or decreases the goodness or malice of an act. All right, so if you have an act and it has a certain degree of goodness by its object and perhaps its intention and all the things we talked about in the last treatise, do the passions increase or decrease the goodness of it? He said, as the Stoics held that every passion of the soul is evil, they consequently held that every passion of the soul lessens the goodness of an act, since the admixture of evil either destroys good altogether or makes it to be less good. And this is true indeed, if by passions we understood none but the inordinate movements of the sensitive appetite, considered as disturbances or ailments. But if we give the name of passions to all the movements of the sensitive appetite, then it belongs to the perfection of man's good that his passions be moderated by reason. For since man's good is founded on reason as its root, that good will be all the more perfect according as it extends to more things pertaining to man. Wherefore, no one questions the fact that it belongs to the perfection of moral good that the actions of the outward members be controlled by the law of reason. Hence, since the sensitive appetite can obey reason, it belongs to the perfection of moral or human good that the passions themselves also should be controlled by reason. Accordingly, just as it is better that man should both will good and do it in his external act, so also does it belong to the perfection of the moral good that man should be moved unto good, not only in respect of his will, but also in respect of his sensitive appetite. So again, we're seeing this hierarchy here, different levels of the soul, where you have the higher part of the soul, which is intellect and will, and then the lower part of the soul, which is the sensitive appetites and also the passions, which need to be controlled by the reason and the will. Article 4, whether any passion is good or evil in its species. Are there any passions that are just bad? He says, we ought seemingly to apply to passions what has been said in regard to acts. That is, that the species of a passion as the species of an act can be considered from 2 points of view. First, according to its natural genus, and thus moral good and evil have no connection with the species of an act or passion. Secondly, according to its moral genus, inasmuch as it is voluntary and controlled by reason. Again, the same theme keeps coming up, right? In this way, moral good and evil can belong to the species of a passion insofar as the object to which a passion tends is of itself in harmony or discord with reason, as is clear in the case of shame, which is based on fear, and envy, which is sorrow for another's good. For thus passions belong to the same species as the external act. So I think what he's saying here is that there are some passions, like envy and shame, whose objects are an evil. Like, for example, envy, the object is sorrow for another's good. And that in and of itself is a bad thing. So I think what he's saying here is that passion would be evil in its species, in its genus. I think that's what he's getting at here. All right, that does it for question 24 of Prima Secunda as we continue this treatise on the passions of the human soul. God bless you. Thanks for watching.